Hi folks, good morning, or whenever really it is you're watching this, and welcome to the very first of my Richard Lehman book reviews. I'm going to be going over all of the full novels and one novella that Richard Lehman had published in his lifetime and indeed after. There were a couple of books released posthumously, and I'm covering a couple of books that never had official releases here in the UK as well. So I've got 37 books in total that I want to talk about, in order from 37 to 1. I'm not going to be giving full reviews of his young adult fiction or some of the other stuff he's done, his westerns or his crime books, of which there are an obscene amount. I mean, Richard Lehman really did write a lot of stuff. And I'm not going to be going through, in this ranking, his short story collections of Fiends or Dreadful Tales, mainly because, as I discovered when I reviewed the Guy and Smith Crabs Omnibus series, there's not much I can say about a short story collection without ruining the short stories, because when stories are literally a couple of pages long, unless I'm just giving out the verdict of yes it's good or no it's bad, I'm literally ruining the story for you. And one of the biggest points of the short story collections is that the stories themselves have maximum impact if you go in knowing nothing. What I will say is that the short story collection Fiends that he wrote is pretty awful. I mean, the actual novella which opens up Fiends, the title of the book, was one of his very early stories. I believe he wrote it in the early 70s, and it's one of the worst things he ever wrote. It's a truly awful story, and the rest of the collection is pretty middling at best. Dreadful Tales, however, which is a fantastic pun on the title, on what the subject is much better. That's actually a collection of pretty solid, so actually really good short stories. And if you ever want to check out some of Richard Lehman's short story collections, Dreadful Tales is the one to go. His novel Out of the Lights is a very short novel and includes 4 short stories after the novel as well. I'm not going to go into detail on them other than they are really good. So with that out of the way, I'm going to be looking at the 37 books, we'll call it, of Lehman's career from worst to best and my opinions on them. And I'm going to start at number 37 with one that I always suspected would end up at the bottom of the pile. And it's weird because this isn't by any means his worst written book. It's not his worst story. It doesn't contain his worst scenes, but it is the one I dislike the most and the one that I find the most troubling. And that is Island from 1995, right at sort of like the tail end of his career, and written at a point where he was very definitely running out of ideas and sort of creating a lot of short stories as full-length novels, which I'll get into more with some of the other books written at this time. Now, the premise of Island is decent. It's a group of people that get trapped on an island. Someone amongst them is trying to kill them off. There's a bit of a mystery as to who it is, and it's not a terribly written book in terms of its discussion of geography and action and things. It's perfectly serviceable. The thing with Island that one of the things with Island that makes it so bad is that it's a first person narration, and the narrator is a young boy called Rupert, and he's by far the most dislikable character that I think Lehman's ever wrote, and somebody who you're locked in a headspace with for about 500 pages, who is this continuously horny, sex obsessed, selfish, self-indulgent individual that is just completely unlikable. This is a guy who has gone on holiday with his girlfriend. He's considering splitting up with his girlfriend, but she gives him an opportunity to go on holiday with her, so he decides not to. And all he does, whilst he's in this perilous situation whereby him and their family basically are trapped, is go on about these girls and how all these female characters look and how attractive he thinks they are and how he fantasises about them. And it's literally just him perving over people for 500 odd pages. It contains these diaries that he's writing with the idea that if he's ever found these diaries, he can hand to the authorities. Except why he's writing so much stuff about the female characters, I don't know, because I'm sure the authorities would find that deeply troubling. The identity of the person who's trying to bump them off is pretty obvious from the get go, and it's a really rather stupid book because very early on the characters got an opportunity to sort of explore this island. It's not a huge island, but nobody actually does because they discover near the end, and I am going to spoil things with this. There was some boats which the killer has stashed away to use as an escape. And these boats, if he just wandered around this island, you would have discovered these boats very, very quickly. But no one actually bothers to look around or do anything. The method in which people are killed is the most stupid. It's as if these people are the most stupid people and they literally haven't watched horror films. They know nothing about survival. Because the plan for the murderer is that everyone will do the most ridiculous thing at the most ridiculous of times, which they do because they are ridiculous characters in a ridiculous Richard Lehman story. And it literally led me to almost yell at the book with how stupid these people are and what they do and why they do. And it's very frustrating as a read. I'm used to people doing silly things in silly situations, but these people were really thick. And it took me out of the story a bit. But I could kind of handle the stupid situations if it wasn't for the fact that Rupert is such a detestable character, and at no point was I invested in the story because of him. In fact, I wanted Rupert to be snuffed out immediately because he's such a horrible character. On top of that, not only is it full of stupid people doing stupid things with a killer that's very obvious doing silly things and a really dislikable character, but it contains the absolute worst of Lehman's writing. And by that I mean the fact that Lehman had a reputation for lots of graphic sex and sexualization. He couldn't write female characters. And the way in which... Sorry, it's just made a weird noise behind me. The way in which Lehman writes female characters and writes male perceptions of them is always based on their looks, their appearance, how attractive they are, and he always throws in sexual violence as a method of shock. And it just becomes quite tedious when you've read 37 Richard Lehman books. The fact that the majority of them contain very similar elements that just aren't shocking after a while. They just come across as lazy. But he also has this horrible habit of... Best way I can describe it is over-sexualising kids in a couple of his books, which is his worst trait by far. And this contains an element of that because there are two girls near the end of the story, both 14-year-olds, whose family have been murdered and are trapped in cages, basically being molested, assaulted, raped, you name it, by this character. And I think someone describes it as it has all of the voyeurism of rape, but none of the effect of it, in that he tries to infantize these characters in terms of their language and their behaviour, but sexualise their appearance and their situations. And it's extremely uncomfortable, and it's why a lot of people who don't like Lehman consider him some sort of pervert or something because of how he does stuff in some of his books, which I don't agree with, but I understand why people think that. And I'll get to it as I go through more of these book reviews. So there's something making a weird noise behind me. It's the ghost of Lehman. But yeah, here we've got these characters who have all these awful things done to them, and yet it never has any effect on them at all, psychologically or physically. They just carry on as normal, having these really infantile discussions where they're going through these terrible things and it doesn't mean anything to them. And it's just really disrespectful in the sense that if you're going to include stuff like this, especially things like child rape, it should have some really big impact on the story, and it just doesn't, which is really sad. I mean, I kind of wish that a lot of Lehman books just didn't have any of that sort of stuff in them at all, because they'd be much better stories. It's by far his worst trait, but don't go into these reviews thinking that all of these books contain that, or that I'm going to be saying a lot of negative things, because like I say, the top tier of Lehman books I think are fantastic, and I'll get to why I think they are. But the lower tier are bad, and this book at number 37 is my least favourite Richard Lehman book because of all of these elements thrown in together. And like I say, it's a shame because the story itself isn't his worst, the writing actually isn't bad at all. It's fast-paced, it's got loads of action, it's quite tense in certain situations, but having such an unlikable group of characters who are thick, such objectification of women, Rupert being the worst character Lehman has ever wrote about in terms of being locked in his headspace, And a book that's over 500 pages long doesn't need to be at all. It's just full of needless descriptions of stuff that don't need to be there, and the stuff with the cages, as well as the ending. The ending, some people think is a good twist ending. I thought it was awful. So yeah, this is by far my least favourite Richard Layman book, and contains all the worst elements of his writing, which is why it's at number 37 on my list. Island. Definitely not a book I'd recommend. Not a book I ever want to read again. A book I genuinely dislike with a passion, which is why it's at bottom. So that's it for that review, and I'll get on to number 36 soon.